silence is rarely empty. It is usually full of answers. When 32-year-old Claire picked up a heavy Mont Blanc pen to sign away her 7-year marriage, her husband, Richard, smirked, thinking he had won the ultimate victory. He assumed her quiet compliance was a sign of defeat, the pathetic resignation of a woman who brought nothing to his elite, fast-paced corporate world. He did not know the ink on those divorce papers was a countdown. He did not know that while he was busy orchestrating a ruthless exit strategy to replace her, Claire's family was busy executing a hostile corporate takeover of his entire existence. Claire stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Upper East Side penthouse, watching the Manhattan skyline glitter against the freezing November night. She held a mug of chamomile tea, her fingers wrapped tightly around the warm ceramic. Behind her, the sharp, rhythmic tapping of Richard's fingers on his MacBook keyboard echoed through the cavernous living room. Richard was a senior partner at Harrison, Sterling and Croft, a prestigious mid-sized corporate law firm with offices in New York, London, and Chicago. Over the past 7 years, Claire had watched him transform from a passionate, idealistic law school graduate into a ruthless, status-obsessed shark. He wore bespoke Tom Ford suits, checked the time on a platinum Rolex Daytona, and spoke in a language entirely composed of billable hours, mergers and acquisitions. And somewhere along the way, he had decided that Claire was no longer enough. "Are you going to stand there all night, or are you going to pack for the Hamptons?" Richard asked, not looking up from his screen. His voice carried that familiar tone of exasperated superiority, the one he usually reserved for junior associates who had failed to properly format a brief. "I thought we were staying in the city this weekend," Claire replied mildly, turning to face him. She wore a simple, unbranded cream cashmere sweater, a piece from Loro Piana that Richard always dismissed as frumpy because it lacked a recognizable logo. "Victoria is hosting a dinner party at her estate in Southampton tomorrow," Richard said, finally shutting his laptop with a loud snap. "Half the executive board from Morgan Stanley will be there. I need to be seen, and I need you to not wear that." He gestured vaguely at her sweater. "Put on something striking, something that says my wife belongs in this tax bracket." Victoria Chase. The name always sent a quiet, icy ripple through the room. Victoria was the newest equity partner at Richard's firm, a sharp-featured, relentlessly ambitious woman whose father was a prominent federal judge. Victoria wore Louboutins like they were combat boots and made no secret of her disdain for Claire. To Victoria, Claire was just Richard's starter wife, a woman who spent her days managing a small, independent botanical shop in Brooklyn and volunteering at a local animal shelter. What neither Richard nor Victoria knew was that Claire's botanical shop was a hobby, a deliberate grounding mechanism. Her maiden name was Claire Kensington. Her father, Arthur Kensington, was the founder and majority shareholder of Kensington Global, a massive private equity conglomerate based in Geneva. Her family's wealth wasn't just old, it was foundational. They didn't buy flashy sports cars or boast about their net worth on Forbes lists. They bought sovereign debt, they bailed out national banks, and they owned the commercial real estate beneath the feet of Manhattan's elite. When Claire met Richard, she had craved normalcy. She wanted a man who loved her for her mind, not her trust fund. She had introduced herself simply as Claire, a girl from upstate New York, and had kept her family's empire entirely separated from her personal life. For a time, it had been a beautiful romance. But ambition is a corrosive acid, and as Richard climbed the corporate ladder, his love for her had dissolved, replaced by a deep resentment of her perceived mediocrity. The betrayal had not been sudden. It had been a slow, agonizing bleed. Claire had noticed the late nights, the sudden emergency client meetings at the Four Seasons, the scent of Le Labo Santal 33 on his collars, a perfume Victoria famously wore. The final fracture occurred 3 days before the Hamptons trip. Claire had been looking for a tax document in Richard's leather briefcase when she found a manila envelope. Inside were early drafts of a divorce settlement. It was heavily annotated in Richard's sharp, aggressive handwriting. Leave her the Brooklyn shop. Offer a $250,000 lump sum. Keep the penthouse. Keep the Aston Martin. Ensure she waives all right to future earnings. And in the margins, written in red ink, undoubtedly Victoria's handwriting, was a note. Make sure the non-disclosure is ironclad. We can't have her crying to the press about being dumped before your promotion. Claire hadn't cried. She hadn't screamed or thrown his expensive scotch against the wall. Instead, she had carefully placed the documents back into the briefcase, exactly as she had found them. She walked into the bathroom, stared at her pale reflection in the vanity mirror, and felt a profound, chilling clarity wash over her. The love she had harbored for Richard extinguished in that moment, leaving behind nothing but cold, calculated resolve. She picked up her phone and dialed a Swiss number she hadn't called for business purposes in nearly a decade. Kensington Private Wealth, a crisp voice answered. Put me through to my father, Claire said softly. Miss Kensington. Right away. When Arthur Kensington answered, his voice was warm but gravelly. Claire, my darling, it's been too long. Hello, Dad, Claire had said, looking out at the city that her family practically owned. I need a favour. I need you to look into a firm called Harrison, Sterling and Croft. Specifically, I need to know who holds their debt, who owns their building, and how vulnerable they are to an aggressive acquisition. Her father had chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. Getting back into the family business, Claire? No, Claire replied, her eyes narrowing. I'm just doing some house cleaning. Now, standing in the living room, as Richard dictated what she should wear to a party hosted by his mistress, Claire simply nodded. I'll pack something suitable, she said quietly. Good, Richard replied, already checking his phone, completely oblivious to the fact that he was speaking to the woman who now held the strings to his entire future. Don't embarrass me, Claire. This weekend is critical. The firm is expanding, and I'm next in line for managing partner. I can't afford any dead weight dragging me down. I promise, Richard, Claire said, turning back to the window. You won't have to worry about my weight dragging you down much longer. The conference room at Harrison, Sterling and Croft was a masterpiece of intimidation. Located on the 54th floor of a sleek glass skyscraper in Midtown, it featured a massive slab of polished black mahogany for a table, ergonomic Herman Miller chairs, and panoramic views of the city meant to make the client feel small and the lawyers feel like gods. Claire sat at the far end of the table, her posture perfect, her expression utterly unreadable. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a simple white silk blouse, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant clasp. She had brought no lawyer with her. Across from her sat Richard, flanked by a smug family law attorney named Gregory Vance, a man infamous in New York circles for financially eviscerating the spouses of wealthy executives. Hovering near the doorway, pretending to review a file but clearly there to gloat, was Victoria Chase. She wore a crimson power suit, a smirk playing on her lips. Claire, I must advise you again that you are entitled to seek independent counsel, Gregory said, though his tone was dripping with condescension. However, given the generous nature of Mr. Sterling's offer and the brevity of your marriage, bringing in outside counsel will likely just drain what little capital you are about to receive. Richard cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at Claire. "Look, Claire, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. We've grown apart. My career trajectory requires a different kind of partnership. I'm being more than fair here." Claire looked down at the thick stack of papers resting in front of her. She didn't touch them. "Fair," she repeated softly, tasting the word. "Extremely," Gregory chimed in, leaning forward and sliding a silver pen across the mahogany table. "Richard is allowing you to keep full ownership of your flower shop." "Botanical shop," Claire corrected smoothly. "Right. He is also offering a one-time settlement of $300,000 to help you transition into a new living arrangement. He keeps the primary residence, the vehicles, and the investment portfolios, as those were accrued through his labor and expertise." Victoria shifted her weight by the door, the click of her stiletto echoing loudly in the tense silence. "It's a very clean break, Claire. Most women in your position would be fighting tooth and nail for alimony. You should thank Richard for not dragging your personal life through discovery." Claire finally raised her eyes and met Victoria's gaze. Victoria expected to see tears, anger, or perhaps pathetic begging. Instead, she saw a terrifying, glacial calm. It was a look that belonged in boardrooms where billions of dollars were traded, not on the face of a modest florist being cast aside. For a fraction of a second, Victoria's smirk faltered. "I see," Claire said. She turned her attention back to Richard. He looked impatient, drumming his fingers on the armrest of his chair. He wanted this over with. He wanted to officially start his new, glamorous life. "Richard, are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" Claire asked. It wasn't a plea. It was a final verification. A final opportunity for him to show a shred of humanity or decency. "It's nothing personal, Claire," Richard said, adjusting his silk tie. "We just operate on different frequencies. I'm building an empire here. You're happy with a quiet life. There's nothing wrong with that. But it doesn't fit my brand." "Your brand?" Claire murmured. "Sign the papers, Claire," Richard sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Let's move on." Claire picked up the silver pen. She didn't read the clauses. She didn't negotiate the insulting $300,000 payout, a sum Richard made in a single month. She didn't fight for the penthouse she had painstakingly decorated. She simply flipped to the final page, aligned the pen, and signed her name with swift, elegant strokes. Claire Kensington. Gregory blinked, momentarily stunned. In his 20 years of high-stakes divorce law, he had never seen a spouse forfeit millions in marital assets without so much as a whimper. He looked at Richard, who looked equally bewildered, though a triumphant grin was rapidly spreading across his face. "Well," Gregory said, quickly pulling the documents back across the table, as if afraid Claire might change her mind. "That concludes the mediation. I'll have these filed with the county clerk by tomorrow morning. You are legally separated as of this moment, pending the judge's stamp." Claire stood up, smoothing the front of her blazer. "Thank you, gentlemen." She turned and began walking toward the door. As she passed Victoria, the other woman leaned in slightly. "Smart girl," Victoria whispered, her voice laced with venomous triumph. "Knowing when you're outmatched is a valuable skill." Claire paused. She turned her head, her face inches from Victoria's. "I completely agree, Victoria. I highly recommend you remember that." Before Victoria could process the odd statement, Claire had already walked out of the conference room. She walked down the long, carpeted hallway of Harrison, Sterling, and Croft, past the glass-walled offices of associates frantically drafting memos, past the receptionist who gave her a sympathetic, pitying smile. Claire stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the door slid shut, sealing her off from the life she had lived for 7 years, she felt an immense, physical weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't Mrs. Sterling anymore. She was Claire Kensington again. When she reached the ground floor lobby of the massive commercial tower, she bypassed the revolving doors leading to the busy Manhattan street and instead walked toward a private security desk located near the rear executive entrance. A man in a sharp black suit stood waiting. "Car is ready, Miss Kensington," the man said respectfully, handing her a sleek black earpiece. "Thank you, David," Claire said, stepping out into the brisk afternoon air. A black Maybach was idling at the curb. She slid into the plush leather back seat and tapped the earpiece. "Connect me to the acquisitions team," she ordered. A few seconds of static, followed by the crisp voice of her father's lead portfolio manager, a brilliant tactician named Julian Hastings. "Miss Kensington, we've been waiting for your signal." "The personal matters have been legally severed," Claire said, looking out the tinted window as the building housing Richard's firm faded into the distance. "What is the status of the Harrison, Sterling and Croft debt?" "We quietly purchased their primary commercial loans from Deutsche Bank yesterday evening," Julian reported. "We also hold the master lease on their building. They are heavily leveraged, Claire. They've been expanding too fast, banking on a merger that we've already secretly derailed. If we call in the loans, they have 30 days to produce $60 million in liquid capital, or they default." "And if they default?" Claire asked, though she already knew the answer. "We trigger the hostile takeover clause. We acquire their assets, their client list, and their intellectual property for pennies on the dollar. The partners get wiped out." Claire smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that Richard had never seen. "Excellent," Claire said softly. "Call in the debt. Initiate the buyout. Let's show Mr. Sterling what a real empire looks like." She disconnected the call, leaning back into the leather seats. The silence in the car was profound, but for Claire, it wasn't empty. It was the sound of an avalanche beginning to fall. The celebration dinner at Le Bernardin was everything Richard had envisioned for his ascension. The private dining room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of a baccarat chandelier, reflecting off the crystal champagne flutes filled with Dom Perignon. Richard sat at the head of the table, his new title, managing partner of Harrison, Sterling and Croft, officially ratified by the board that very afternoon. Victoria sat to his right, wearing a backless emerald silk dress, her hand resting possessively on his thigh under the table. To his left sat William Harrison, the firm's 60-year-old founding partner, a man whose face was deeply lined by decades of high-stakes corporate warfare. "To Richard," William said, raising his glass, his voice booming over the low hum of the exclusive restaurant, "who engineered the Morgan Stanley merger and brought this firm into the 21st century. May our billable hours be endless and our liabilities non-existent." "Cheers," the table of senior equity partners echoed in unison. Richard took a sip, the crisp, cold champagne tasting like absolute victory. It had been exactly 1 week since Claire had signed the divorce papers. The judge had expedited the filing, a favor called in by Victoria's father, the federal judge. Claire was gone, erased from his life with a meager $300,000 check and the keys to her little flower shop. He was unencumbered, wealthy, and standing at the absolute pinnacle of his career. His phone buzzed in his tuxedo pocket. He ignored it. 5 seconds later, it buzzed again. Then a third time. Frowning, Richard pulled the device out. It was his private assistant, calling with an emergency override. He excused himself with a charming smile and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway near the coat check. "What is it, Sarah?" he snapped. "I told you I was not to be interrupted tonight." "Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry. Sarah's voice trembled. She sounded close to tears. "But you need to look at your email immediately. It's the firm's finance department. Deutsche Bank just sent a formal notice." "A notice of what? The commercial property expansion?" Richard rubbed his temples, annoyed that mundane administrative issues were bleeding into his coronation night. "No, sir. A notice of sale and immediate debt call. Deutsche Bank no longer holds our primary commercial loans. They sold our debt paper yesterday to a private equity conglomerate in Geneva." Richard froze. The champagne in his stomach suddenly felt like lead. Selling commercial debt wasn't entirely uncommon, but it was usually done in tranches, not overnight, and certainly not to a foreign private equity firm, unless the firm was distressed. Harrison, Sterling, and Croft wasn't distressed. They were highly leveraged, yes, but they were profitable. "Who bought the debt?" Richard asked, his voice dropping an octave. "A firm called Kensington Global," Sarah replied, her voice shaking. "And Mr. Sterling, they are citing a technical covenant breach in our expansion filings. They are calling in the entire principal, $60 million, payable in 29 days, or they trigger a default and asset seizure." "That's impossible," Richard hissed, drawing the attention of a passing sommelier. He lowered his voice, pacing frantically. "They can't call in the debt on a technicality. We have 30 days to cure any breach. Who the hell is Kensington Global?" "They are one of the largest private wealth funds in Europe, sir. We tried to reach their legal department, but we keep getting stonewalled by a shell corporation. Mr. Sterling, there's more. The shell company that bought our debt? Public records show they also purchased the master lease to our office building in Midtown 3 days ago." Richard leaned against the silk-papered wall, struggling to process the information. This wasn't a standard financial transaction. This was a targeted, synchronized assassination. Whoever Kensington Global was, they had trapped the law firm in a vice grip. If they defaulted on the loan, Kensington would seize the firm's assets, their client list, and their intellectual property. The partners would be wiped out, personally liable for the remaining debts due to the aggressive mezzanine financing Richard himself had pushed for. "Call William's assistant," Richard ordered, his breathing shallow. "Get the finance team back into the office. I don't care what time it is. We need a bridge loan from Goldman Sachs by tomorrow morning." But the bridge loan never came. Over the next 3 weeks, Richard's perfect life dissolved into a waking nightmare. Every major bank in Manhattan, J.P. Morgan, Citi, Morgan Stanley, mysteriously denied their applications for emergency refinancing. Doors that had been wide open to Richard just a month prior were suddenly, violently slammed shut. Former allies wouldn't return his calls. It was as if an invisible, omnipotent hand was actively blacklisting them from the global financial system. The firm's atmosphere turned toxic. Junior associates, sensing the blood in the water, began quietly clearing out their desks. Equity partners turned on each other in screaming matches behind glass walls. Victoria, whose own capital contributions were tied up in the firm, became frantic and vicious, blaming Richard for the aggressive expansion strategy that had left them vulnerable. By day 28, Harrison, Sterling, and Croft was functionally bankrupt. The $60 million was a ghost they could not catch. Late that evening, William Harrison sat in Richard's office, looking 10 years older. He stared blankly at the breathtaking view of the Manhattan skyline. "They won't even negotiate over the phone," William rasped, swirling a glass of neat bourbon. Kensington's representatives finally sent an email. "If we want to discuss a structured surrender to save our personal assets from being liquidated, we have to go to their North American headquarters tomorrow at noon." "We go then," Richard said, his voice hollow, his custom Tom Ford suit hanging slightly loose on his frame after weeks of stress-induced weight loss. We go, we beg for terms, and we find out who the hell is doing this to us. The North American headquarters of Kensington Global occupied the top 3 floors of a towering, ultra-modern skyscraper in Hudson Yards. The lobby alone exuded a level of wealth that made Richard's law firm look like a suburban accounting office. It was all imported Italian marble, brushed titanium, and silent, intimidating security personnel in tailored black suits. At exactly 11:55 a.m., Richard, Victoria, and William stepped off the private elevator, onto the 81st floor. They were met by a severe-looking executive assistant who didn't offer a smile, only a brisk nod. Mr. Harrison, Mr. Sterling, Ms. Chase. The Director of Acquisitions will see you now, she said smoothly, turning on her heel and leading them down a vast corridor lined with abstract modern art. Richard adjusted his tie, his palms sweating. He had spent the entire car ride rehearsing his pitch. He would appeal to the director's financial sensibilities. He would offer them a 40% equity stake in the firm in exchange for debt forgiveness. He would charm them, litigate them, or outsmart them. He was Richard Sterling. He always found a way out. The assistant opened a set of massive, soundproofed oak double doors, gesturing for them to enter. The boardroom was terrifying in its minimalism. A single slab of live-edge black walnut served as the conference table, overlooking a panoramic, dizzying view of the Hudson River. Sitting at the head of the table, her back turned to them as she looked out the window, was a slender woman in a meticulously tailored, midnight blue Alexander McQueen suit. "Director?" William began, stepping forward, using his most authoritative courtroom voice. "We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. I am William Harrison, and this is my managing partner, Richard Sterling. We believe there has been a profound misunderstanding regarding our commercial covenants." "There is no misunderstanding, William," a voice said. The voice was soft, melodic, and chillingly familiar. Victoria stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. Richard felt his heart slam against his ribs. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The leather chair slowly swiveled around. Claire sat there, her legs elegantly crossed, a manila folder resting on the table in front of her. Her hair, usually worn in a messy bun or a simple clasp, was blown out into sleek, razor-sharp waves. Her face was devoid of the warm, accommodating smile Richard had known for 7 years. Instead, her eyes were dark, flat, and absolute. "Claire?" Richard whispered, the name falling from his lips like a heavy stone. "Hello, Richard," Claire said, intertwining her fingers and resting them on the table. She looked past him to the crimson-faced woman at his side. "Victoria. That color still doesn't suit you." "What? What is this?" Victoria stammered, looking frantically around the room as if expecting an old Swiss billionaire to step out from behind the curtains. "What are you doing here? Did Richard hire you to—" "To what, Victoria?" Claire interrupted, her voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "To arrange the flowers for your bankruptcy hearing." William Harrison looked between Richard and Claire, utter bewilderment contorting his face. "Richard, who is this woman? Why is your ex-wife sitting in the director's chair?" Claire didn't give Richard the chance to answer. She picked up the manila folder and casually tossed it down the length of the table. It slid perfectly, stopping right in front of William. "Allow me to introduce myself, Mr. Harrison. My name is Claire Kensington. I am the sole heir to Kensington Global and the acting director of North American Acquisitions. And as of 12:01 a.m. tomorrow, I am the new owner of your firm." Richard gripped the back of a leather chair to keep his knees from buckling. His mind raced, violently connecting the dots he had been too arrogant to see. Claire Kensington. She had never lied about her name, but she had never elaborated. She wore unbranded clothes that he thought were cheap, but were actually quiet luxury. She managed a botanical shop in Brooklyn, not because she had no ambition, but because she had nothing left to prove. "This is a joke," Richard choked out, his face pale, pointing a trembling finger at her. "This is fraud. You were a florist. You didn't even understand my work." "I understood perfectly, Richard," Claire said softly, rising from her chair. She walked slowly towards them, the click of her heels the only sound in the cavernous room. "I understood that you were funneling firm capital into a risky mezzanine fund. I understood that you were violating your loan covenants by opening the Chicago branch prematurely. I understood your work better than you did. That's why it was so incredibly easy to buy your debt and crush you." "You set us up," Victoria hissed, stepping forward, her hands balled into fists. "You bought the debt just to ruin him because he left you." Claire let out a low, humorless laugh. She stopped a few feet from them, radiating an aura of total, crushing power. "Victoria, please don't flatter yourself," Claire said, looking down at the other woman. "Richard leaving me was the greatest favor he ever did. No, I didn't buy your debt out of a broken heart. I bought it because Richard is sloppy. He builds on sand. When I saw the early drafts of our divorce settlement, when I saw that you two intended to leave me with nothing while protecting his unearned assets, I realized something." Claire's eyes locked onto Richard's. He shrank back, suddenly realizing that the woman standing before him was an apex predator he had mistaken for a house cat. "I realized," Claire continued, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "that you didn't respect me because you thought I lacked power. So I decided to show you exactly what power looks like." William Harrison, realizing his entire legacy was evaporating, bypassed Richard entirely. "Miss Kensington," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "Please. Richard's personal vendettas have nothing to do with the rest of the partners. We employ hundreds of people. We can restructure. We can remove Richard as managing partner today. Right now." "Hey!" Richard snapped, turning to William in betrayal. "You can't do that." "I just did," William snarled, before turning back to Claire with pleading eyes. Claire tilted her head, observing the frantic betrayal with mild amusement. "It's too late for that, Mr. Harrison. You allowed a vain, reckless man to leverage your firm into oblivion. Your equity is zero. Your client list is being absorbed by our in-house legal team. By tomorrow, Harrison, Sterling, and Croft will cease to exist." "Claire, please," Richard begged, the arrogance finally draining from him, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling shell. "I have nothing else. The penthouse, the cars, they're all collateral. If you trigger the default, I'm personally bankrupt. I'll lose my license. I'll have nothing." Claire walked back to her desk and picked up a sleek silver Mont Blanc pen. It was the exact same model she had used to sign the divorce papers. "You offered me $300,000, Richard," Claire said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "A generous sum to help me transition. I'll tell you what, I am going to buy your firm for exactly $300,000. I'm going to liquidate your assets, sell your precious Tom Ford suits to pay the creditors, and banish you from practicing law in this city." She held up the pen, the silver catching the harsh midday light. "I suggest you learn to appreciate a quiet life, Richard, because the loud one is over. The financial world is a massive, interconnected nervous system, and by 6 a.m. the following morning, it was having a localized seizure. The Wall Street Journal broke the story first, their digital edition running a headline that sent shockwaves from Wall Street to Canary Wharf. The $300,000 vengeance, Kensington Global, swallows Manhattan law titan in brutal overnight takeover. The article detailed the staggering speed of the debt acquisition, the ruthless execution of the default clauses, and the catastrophic collapse of Harrison, Sterling, and Croft. While the paper couldn't explicitly verify the personal revenge angle, the anonymous quotes from terrified junior associates painted a vivid picture of a firm ambushed by an unseen, unstoppable force. Richard sat in his darkened midtown office, the motorized blinds drawn shut against the morning sun. His phone had been ringing incessantly for 3 hours. Clients were jumping ship faster than the legal department could process the paperwork. The prestigious Morgan Stanley executives, the ones Richard had courted at Victoria's Southampton estate just a month ago, had formally pulled their retainer, citing the firm's unstable financial optics. He hadn't slept. He hadn't changed his clothes. The sharp, arrogant managing partner who had dismissed his wife as a mediocre florist was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed man staring into the abyss of his own hubris. The glass door to his office swung open, shattering the heavy silence. Victoria stood in the doorway. She was not wearing her usual tailored crimson power suit. Instead, she wore a trench coat over a muted black dress, holding a heavy cardboard banker's box filled with her personal files and desk ornaments. "You're leaving?" Richard asked, his voice raw, devoid of its usual silver-tongued confidence. "I'm surviving," Victoria corrected, stepping into the room and letting the door click shut behind her. Her face was pale, and the affectionate, possessive demeanor she usually reserved for Richard had completely evaporated. She looked at him not with love, but with calculating disgust. "Victoria, wait. We can fix this," Richard pleaded, standing up, his hands resting heavily on his mahogany desk. "William is panicking, but we have connections. Your father is a federal judge. We can file an emergency injunction to halt the asset seizure. We can claim Kensington acted in bad faith." "My father called me at 5 a.m, Richard," Victoria snapped, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "He told me that Arthur Kensington called him personally. Do you understand what that means? The Kensingtons don't just have money, they have gravity. My father told me to sever all ties with you immediately, or risk having my own career collateralized in the fallout. So you're just running, after everything we planned?" Richard's voice rose, desperate and disbelieving. "You're the one who told me to give her a lowball settlement. You're the one who wrote those notes in the margins. And you're the idiot who left them where she could find them," Victoria yelled back, the polished veneer cracking entirely. "You told me she was nobody. You told me she was a quiet, domestic mouse who would just take the check and cry in Brooklyn. You didn't tell me you were married to a financial warlord." She hoisted the heavy box higher on her hip. "I have a meeting with Claire in an hour." Richard froze. The blood drained from his face. "What? Why?" "Because unlike you, I know when a war is lost," Victoria said coldly. "I'm offering her my voting shares and my testimony regarding your improper use of client escrow accounts to pad the mezzanine fund. In exchange, she lets me walk away with my license and my initial capital investment intact." "You're testifying against me," Richard whispered, the absolute betrayal striking him like a physical blow. "That's disbarment, Victoria. That's prison." "It's business, Richard," she replied, echoing the exact phrase he had used on Claire weeks earlier. She didn't offer a sympathetic glance or a lingering touch. She simply turned the handle and walked out of the glass office, leaving Richard completely and utterly alone in the dark. An hour later, Victoria sat in the same terrifyingly minimalist Hudson Yards boardroom. Claire sat across from her, perfectly poised, sipping a black coffee. Beside Claire sat Nathaniel, Kensington Global's sharp-eyed lead auditor, silently taking notes. Victoria laid a thick flash drive on the live edge walnut table and slid it across. "Everything is on there," Victoria said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Emails, internal memos, bank routing numbers. It proves Richard knowingly bypassed the firm's risk compliance committee to secure the loans that you ultimately bought. If you hand this to the SEC, he is finished. In return, I want immunity from Kensington's civil suits, and I want my $2 million equity buy-in returned." Claire looked at the flash drive. She didn't touch it. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her dark eyes entirely unreadable. "Victoria," Claire said softly, setting her cup down. "Do you genuinely believe I need your help to destroy Richard?" Victoria swallowed hard. "It expedites the process. It's leverage." "I am the leverage," Claire corrected smoothly. She gestured to Nathaniel, who didn't even look at the flash drive. Nathaniel and his team cracked Richard's encrypted offshore accounts 3 days ago. We already have the escrow data. We already filed the SEC whistleblower report this morning at 8 a.m. Your leverage is redundant. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Victoria's chest. "But I'm cooperating. I'm handing you the managing partner on a silver platter." "You are handing me a drowning man while you try to steal a life raft," Claire replied, leaning forward slightly, her gaze pinning Victoria to the chair. "I read the settlement drafts, Victoria. I know exactly what you thought of me. And I know exactly what you are. You are an opportunist who built her career on nepotism and the wreckage of other women. You don't get a golden parachute today." Claire slid the flash drive back across the table. It stopped mere inches from Victoria's trembling hands. "Your equity is gone. It was absorbed in the default," Claire stated, her voice as final as a gavel strike. "You are personally liable for the remaining debts of the firm, just like Richard. I suggest you call your father, Victoria, because Kensington Global is coming for everything you own." Victoria stared at the woman across the table, finally realizing the true depth of her miscalculation. Claire wasn't just taking revenge, she was performing a total, systemic eradication. Victoria opened her mouth to argue, to plead, but the terrifying silence in Claire's eyes stopped her. Shaking, Victoria took her flash drive and fled the room. Friday at 5 p.m. marked the official deadline for the $60 million cure period. At exactly 5:01 p.m., the heavy glass doors of Harrison, Sterling, and Croft were locked from the outside. The takeover was mechanical, emotionless, and devastatingly efficient. Dozens of private security contractors in dark suits swept the 54th floor, escorting the remaining partners out of the building. Men in grey Kensington Global polos began boxing up servers, archiving physical files, and stripping the mahogany walls of their expensive artwork. Richard was the last to leave. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the sunset bleed red across the Manhattan skyline. 2 security guards stood silently by the door, waiting for him. He had nothing in his hands. His computer was seized. His files were locked. Even the expensive scotch he had kept in his credenza had been catalogued as a firm asset. "Mr. Sterling," one of the guards said, his tone polite but firm. "It's time." Richard didn't argue. The fight had been completely drained out of him. He walked out of his office, down the long, carpeted hallway, past the empty cubicles and the dark conference rooms where he had once felt like a god. The silence of the dead firm was deafening, but the nightmare was far from over. When Richard finally emerged from the commercial tower and hailed a cab to his Upper East Side penthouse, he expected a sanctuary. He expected to pour a drink, collapse on his imported Italian leather sofa, and try to figure out how to rebuild. Instead, he found the lobby of his building swarming with men in tactical gear and moving uniforms. The concierge, a man who normally greeted Richard with obsequious deference, wouldn't even meet his eye. Richard took the private elevator to the penthouse floor. When the doors opened, he was greeted by the sight of his front door propped wide open. Inside, a team of appraisers was tagging furniture. "Hey, what the hell is going on here?" Richard yelled, sprinting into the foyer. A tall man in a tailored suit, holding a tablet, stepped forward. "Mr. Sterling, I am Arthur Kensington's personal liaison. We are executing the asset seizure." "This is my private residence," Richard screamed, his voice cracking. "The firm defaulted, not me. You can't touch my home." "Actually, sir, we can," the liaison said calmly, swiping on his tablet and holding it up for Richard to see. It was a digital copy of the mezzanine loan agreement Richard had signed to fund the firm's Chicago expansion. When you secured the emergency financing 3 months ago, you signed a personal guarantee. You collateralized your personal assets to secure the corporate debt. Since the firm cannot cover the $60 million, the debt transfers to you. Richard stared at his own signature on the screen, feeling physically sick. He had signed it because he was arrogant. He had signed it because he believed the firm would never fail. That he would never fail. "The penthouse is now property of Kensington Global," the liaison continued, stepping aside as 2 movers carried Richard's prized leather sofa out the door. "As is the Aston Martin in the garage, which is currently being loaded onto a flatbed tow truck. Your bank accounts have been frozen pending a full forensic audit by the SEC. I have nowhere to go," Richard stammered, looking around at the rapidly emptying apartment. "Miss Kensington anticipated that," the liaison said. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a standard white business envelope, handing it to Richard. "She left this for you." With trembling hands, Richard tore open the envelope. Inside was a single, crisp cashier's check. It was made out to Richard Sterling. The amount was for exactly $300,000. Attached to the check was a small, handwritten note on heavy cardstock. The handwriting was elegant, familiar, and utterly merciless. A generous sum to help you transition into your new living arrangement. I suggest you learn to budget. See. Richard stared at the check, the sound of his entire life being dismantled echoing around him. He thought back to the conference room just a month ago. He remembered sliding the same insulting sum across the table to Claire, demanding she be grateful for his scraps. He remembered telling her that she didn't fit his brand. He fell to his knees on the bare hardwood floor, the $300,000 check slipping from his fingers. The apartment was stripped bare, cold and empty. He had traded an empire built on genuine love for a house of cards built on ego. And now, the wind had finally blown. 6 months later, the biting wind of a brutal February morning whipped through the streets of Astoria, Queens. Richard pulled the collar of his generic, off-the-rack wool blend coat tighter around his neck, shivering as he stepped out of the N-train subway station. He carried a battered pleather briefcase, a far cry from the custom Italian leather he used to wield like a weapon. The descent had been absolute, a vertical drop into a reality he had spent his entire adult life mocking. Following the collapse of Harrison, Sterling and Croft, the Securities and Exchange Commission had descended upon Richard with the full, unyielding force of the federal government. Lead investigator Thomas Caldwell, an unforgiving bureaucrat who despised Wall Street arrogance, had frozen all of Richard's hidden assets within 48 hours. The $300,000 cashier's check Claire had left him, the ultimate insult, had vanished with terrifying speed. Without his law license, which had been permanently revoked by the New York State Bar Association, Richard had to learn the brutal mathematics of survival. Criminal defense retainer. $150,000 handed immediately to a mid-tier defense attorney named Simon Glick to keep Richard out of a federal penitentiary. Civil restitution, $85,000 seized by the state to partially refund the escrow accounts he had illegally tapped for the mezzanine fund. Living expenses and debt. The remaining $65,000 evaporated over 5 months, swallowed by back taxes, credit card companies, and the exorbitant rent for a cramped, mold-smelling studio apartment above a noisy 24-hour laundromat. Richard now worked as a freelance paralegal under a pseudonym, reviewing tedious discovery documents for bottom-feeding personal injury firms at $20 an hour. He spent his days staring at a cracked laptop screen, correcting formatting errors for men who didn't possess a tenth of the legal acumen he once had. As he walked down the slush-filled sidewalk, clutching a lukewarm bodega coffee, his phone vibrated. It was an alert from a legal blog he still masochistically followed. The headline glowed under the grey morning sky. Former legal titans headquarters transformed. Kensington Global unveils the Sanctuary Project. Richard clicked the link, his thumbs numb from the cold. The article featured a high-resolution photograph of the 54th floor of his former Midtown skyscraper. The imposing black mahogany tables and aggressive modern art were gone. In their place were warm, sunlit, collaborative spaces, filled with lush greenery and comfortable seating. Claire had not simply absorbed his firm to liquidate it. She had repurposed the entire commercial lease. The Sanctuary Project, the article detailed, was a massive, heavily endowed, non-profit legal center, fully funded by Kensington Global. Its sole mission was to provide elite, pro bono legal representation to spouses who were being financially abused, hidden from, or aggressively railroaded in high-net-worth divorce proceedings. She had taken the very floor where Richard had planned to discard her and turned it into a fortress to protect women, just like her. Richard felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. He kept reading. The article mentioned Victoria Chase. Her fate had been equally catastrophic. After the flash drive incident, the SEC had subpoenaed Victoria's private communications. While she avoided prison by turning state's witness against Richard, the scandal had stained her powerful family. Her father, the esteemed federal judge, had been forced into an early, disgraced retirement to avoid an ethics probe. Victoria was now reportedly living in a small town in Connecticut, working as an assistant manager at a mid-range retail boutique, completely exiled from New York elite society. We built a house of cards, Richard thought bitterly, tossing his empty coffee cup into a freezing trash can, and we invited a hurricane inside. Later that afternoon, driven by a masochistic impulse he couldn't entirely explain, Richard took the subway into Brooklyn. He walked through the affluent, tree-lined streets of Park Slope until he reached the corner where Claire's botanical shop, the Verdant Root, was located. He had expected the shop to be gone, perhaps relocated to a massive flagship store on Fifth Avenue to match her true billionaire status. But as he turned the corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. The shop was exactly where it had always been. The charming, dark green awning, the intricate displays of ferns and orchids in the frosted windows, the soft, warm glow of Edison bulbs illuminating the interior. It looked entirely unchanged, a quiet pocket of peace in the chaotic city. Richard stood across the street, hiding behind the collar of his coat, the snow beginning to fall gently around him. He peered through the glass. Claire was inside. She was wearing a simple, unbranded cream cashmere sweater, the exact same Loro Piana sweater he had mocked on the night he demanded she pack for the Hamptons. Her hair was pulled back in a loose clasp. She was laughing, her face radiant, and entirely free of the tension she had carried during their final years together. She was carefully potting a delicate white orchid, speaking animatedly to an elderly customer. Beside her stood David, the sharp-suited security operative, now wearing a more relaxed civilian sweater, but still keeping a watchful, protective eye on the perimeter. Richard took a step off the curb. He didn't know what he intended to do. Apologize? Beg for a loan? Demand to know why she hadn't just told him who she was from the beginning? But before his foot could hit the asphalt, David's eyes snapped up. Through the glass, across the busy street, the security operative locked eyes with Richard. David didn't reach for a weapon or make a threatening gesture. He simply shook his head once, a slow, absolute dismissal. You do not belong here. Then Claire looked up. For a fraction of a second, her eyes met Richard's through the falling snow. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. He waited for the sneer of triumph, the vindictive glare of a woman who had thoroughly crushed her enemy. But Claire didn't sneer. Her expression didn't change at all. She looked at him with the exact same mild, polite indifference she had given the cashier at the grocery store. He was not her enemy anymore. He was a ghost. He was an administrative error she had corrected 6 months ago. She calmly broke eye contact, turned back to her customer, and handed over the potted orchid with a brilliant, genuine smile. The realization hit Richard harder than the bankruptcy, harder than the disbarment, harder than the loss of the penthouse. He had spent his entire life desperately trying to be seen, to be feared, to be recognized as powerful. But Claire didn't need to be seen to be powerful. Her power was in her silence, in her profound, unshakable security in who she was. Richard stood in the freezing snow for a long time, watching the life he had thrown away. He had traded a woman who held the world in her hands for a woman who only wanted the world's attention. He slowly turned away, pulling his thin coat tighter against the wind, and began the long, cold walk back to the subway, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving anonymity of the city. True power rarely screams. It whispers, and sometimes it simply remains silent. Richard's tragic downfall was engineered not by a sudden, vindictive plot, but by his own blind, consuming arrogance. He mistook Claire's quiet grace for weakness, and her lack of pretension for a lack of worth. In his relentless pursuit of a superficial empire, he eagerly signed away his most valuable asset, failing to realize that the very pen he handed her was the instrument of his own execution. Claire's ultimate vengeance wasn't just the financial destruction of his firm, but the absolute, crushing revelation of his own insignificance. In the end, Richard was left exactly as he had left her, with nothing but the cold reality of a signature, forever haunted by the devastating consequences of underestimating the silent woman in the room.